digital transformation, why, I think we'll do a little tiny bit on why, what is it and how do you benefit. Certainly about empowering customers, certainly about engaging customers, around improving internal operations, those kind of those things. So when I look at why, the slide when you first look at it is quite busy, and you start to dig underneath the numbers. So when this was done earlier in the year, global population is about 7.4 billion people, which is what the top thing says, growing relatively slowly. If we move down, it says approximately half of those people are active on the internet, and that's growing again, 14% or so. The interesting thing starts as we go further down. Social media, 36% of the world's population, but growing at 21% a year. People on mobile devices, already 64% of the world's population on a mobile device, and that's growing at 28% a year. And people that are looking at social media on mobile devices, again, 27% growth per year. So why is this important? It's because of these last two things. People on mobile devices and looking at social media is growing exponentially. So that's why, in a snapshot, that's why looking at some of this stuff is brilliant. What do we think of digital? What might we have seen over the last couple of years? You might have seen some of these things. These are the areas that Infrasoft as a business has been active in. And Rajesh, maybe do you want to pick one or two of these to talk about?
So, without for the purpose of this discussion, we'll try and segregate digital as digital 1.0 and 2.0. Because what we saw as the digital era earlier was typically mobile applications. And it was around the whole concept of SMAC, where you had social media integration, mobility, analytics, and then importantly the adoption of cloud. And that's been happening over the last 5 to 6 years. And I would think in terms of maturity, it is quite mature on retail banking and retail overall as a business, FMCG, but not as much in the investment management business per se, given the aspects around security and the whole policies around BYOD, etc. But these are some of the apps that you probably have seen, which are there in the market as ready-made apps, which typically have been something which have been indicative of what digital stood for. But we thought in this event we'll try and cover what was further on to this. What was digital 1 and what is digital 2.0? And that's what the session is about. We've looked at some of the advanced analytics piece, which is in terms of social analytics, sentiment analysis, etc., which is the whole part of big data today, which is catching up pace. A lot of adoption of big data is happening in terms of looking at collating the very important unstructured data that typically was not harnessed for decision making.
There is a journey for most organisations in terms of digital maturity, ranging from the left-hand side of the classic things that we all find, most businesses find themselves in at a point in time, and I suspect aspirationally people are aiming towards the top right. But interesting to hear where people find themselves and what you see.
So if you looked at the gradual adoption of the digital journey, we thought we'd just put a step up ladder to say how has it been going for firms and what would typically be coming up in the future for yourselves as well. We've moved obviously away from the legacy solutions block to the next one, which typically has been around the core part of transformation on the core engines, looking at adoption of CRM, looking at re-architecture in terms of introducing a middleware adoption overall, and typically where it was disjointed channels, firms have started looking at now a clear multi-channel strategy when you look at level 2. The true digital transformation, of course, has been in various forms, whether it is financial services, government, has been around utility-based service, where you will have common data pools, which will be some things like, let's say, common customer data, common data on key aspects of the business, which would then be able to be utilized through a private cloud across the firm. Then there's the whole aspect of enterprise applications, so moving away from point solutions to enterprise applications, and B2B solutions, where you have trading partner interfaces, etc., being more open where the firm opens up to electronic transactions with other firms, and looking at the customer insights more in depth. That is something that has been the part of digital 1.0 in true sense, where the chief marketing officer has now become more important in the firm, looking at that data that's available of the customer client base, as well as looking at the behavior patterns of the clients, and then seeing what can be done in terms of cross-selling, and also addressing grievances, etc., through that insight. Then it's been about the identity management. So digital identities have been prevalent, and the adoption of that is increasing. I've seen this in India, for example, where submission of all the returns that we do for government are all through the digital identity for directors. Big data and analytics has been a key aspect, and I think everyone's sort of having their hands around it to put out a pilot for big data and try and see what it has to offer. That's where what we've seen as the level of adoption for big data and analytics at the firms currently. And of course, in digital transformation, the whole introduction of enterprise service bus has been one of the more important aspects. And I would believe that a lot of the integration work is pending because of the adoption of enterprise service bus not being prevalent in many firms. But in the journey of digital transformation, I think this will be an important step, because it allows you to access disparate sources of data as they may like, and also look at integrating social media data and things such as that from an unstructured point into the overall big data strategy to ensure that you are able to get better insights of your business. And moving on to digital innovation, this is where we see the continuous path of innovation on digital, which is what we will be speaking on the subject today, which will be looking at social analytics, the part of having automated functions, having bots to automate the functions, the whole integration of Internet of Things and how a business would interact with the Internet of Things in their environment, and Omni Channel being an important part of making sure that the orchestration of business processes are similar across all the channels. Beacons are some aspects that we've seen, and I did hear about a few pilots in Jersey, for example, potentially, where beacons could be used, for example, to sort out parking and things such as that, where through a near field communication, you're able to identify the client from, let's say, about 100 meters, 100 feet, and then try and assess the identification of the client and then provide the service. Virtual reality is something that's catching up, and similarly augmented reality. If you look at Pokemon Go, that's one of the things that's been most famous, and I should tell you about Pokemon Go in India. A lot of people have found it difficult to have their children to go to temples, because the new generation would rather be on WhatsApp and Facebook than see the statues in the temples. And of late, we had this incident where one of my colleagues was telling me that his child said, do you know there's a Hanuman temple just around the corner? And he said, oh, finally you got to taking up getting to temples now. She said, no, it's because I know there's a Pikachu that I can pick up there. And this is something that has made things interesting. Pokemon Go is something that is really catching up. I would like to believe that this will be the trend forward for typically in aspects of high street banking, where you could actually have some learnings to be done from Pokemon Go and introduce the whole aspect of cross-selling beyond the realms of banking and identify partners with whom you could have the so-called Pikachus being available. Similarly, predictive analytics, very important. We've seen the use of predictive analysis in, especially in anti-fraud, where we are able to determine what's a fraudulent scenario. Infrasofttech has been one of the leading products on anti-money laundering in the market and anti-fraud. And we've used the predictive analytics technology to enable that the fact that we are able to detect fraud before it happens, or actually depict a fraudulent scenario before fraud could happen. And then the important part is sentiment analysis. With the whole advent of social media, the acceptance by clients, etc., you will find that grievance management and also praise at the same time, how you manage the customer sentiment is important. And using tools to do that will probably be the best way forward. Given that you will have millions of customers pouring in their content, there will also be past data that needs to be analyzed. And before you take steps towards, let's say, either a new product launch or new technologies that you adopt, going through what data you have will be an important aspect. So sentiment analysis here is another important part within the digital journey, which will probably make a firm go completely digital, because then they could adopt electronic channels and take in the data that's coming from multiple channels and react to it. Blockchain, of course, has been one, and it's been a subject that's talked about a lot, to see how blockchain would be adopted by various firms. I personally believe, yeah, it has a future, but probably a couple of years down the line, where a couple of important things to sort out on blockchain will be the legislation around it. Is it legal? The recent hack of blockchain as a technology has not been useful in some ways, because now you've got to relook at the strategy and say, before we make a legislation, is it really safe to do so? But digital currency is one adoption. But I think the blockchain usage overall is going to be pretty vast. Ledgers to start with, and then you could have artifacts and this aspect of trust and fiduciary firms taking up blockchain to have registers and hires being able to be logged, and then have a sort of a legality aspect to it rendered, which could then say you maintain that depository and get paid for managing that deposit. It's a business that probably will help the first takers, because somebody who uses a blockchain and subscribes to it is probably going to stick to it for the 5 to 10 year period. So anyone who gets into it first will probably be able to harness a lot of clientele on the so-called new digital registers, so to say. There is the demand for data being resident on devices, but I think the important aspect of big data comes in where not necessarily from who utilizes the data, but also to say how would you use the vast data that's available to provide a better service. So if you look at a bank, yes, their customers could say we'll have our own passbooks, sort of e-passbook on our mobile, we've got our transactions and we'll pass on the transactions to you. And I have it all on my mobile, I don't want to probably interact with the branch anymore because I've got it here. But what will happen is that with regards to the aspect of risk management that the banks need to look at and the various aspects of their own business, big data will still be a very important aspect from the perspective of need for it. The other part is with regards to the channels. A relational source of data will be difficult to sort of collate, you'll find it difficult to collate all of the data in a relational source for content that's there as unstructured text on Twitter, on the internet, etc. And I think what big data has to offer is to look at looking at what's the sentiment in that unstructured data, and not necessarily storing it all, but making sure that the sentiment is valued and that is sort of encapsulated in your entire execution of your business. So I think big data will continue to get bigger.
What is big data? And I guess the traditionalists in the room, me, myself included, think a lot about structured data and how do we store it, how do we then bring it together, that kind of relational database bits, and yet, well, what is this thing about big data? And I think for me originally it was, well, it's just the vastness of all the information out there when we bring together structured and unstructured. But it's not, as I am learning, it's not necessarily just about the vastness. These kind of 4 V's, if you like, the volume, the variety, the velocity and veracity of it all. We can, using big data type technologies, it's kind of idea of a data lake rather than a data warehouse, if you like, doesn't necessarily mean you're dealing with huge amounts of data, but you're dealing with lots of different types, and that it can be changing quite quickly. So what types of technology might you want to be thinking about when that's happening? And I guess we've probably touched on in already sort of uses of this around fraud detection or predictive analytics.
I think I looked at a couple of examples where data lakes and linked data links are quite prevalent, and it will be very much used, I would assume, in the financial sector. A typical example there is to look at a scenario where you have a volatile market, and those of you who relate to the pound will definitely agree now, where you find that there are particular scenarios that have happened which may be able to help you manage your proprietary portfolios better. So when you look at linking the event to say the movement in, let's say, the FTSE index vis-a-vis, let's say, the rate of bonds, etc., having these disparate actions or events and building a lake that can capture this, and then building data links that can say, in the scenario of this happening, what happened to the FTSE? So if I were to invest in stocks, then what should I expect when this particular set of events happen? Or if you're looking for a particular big event, a big boom, a big crash, how do you depict it? I think that's where you'll find big data quite useful, because the data links will be able to tell you about what you could expect given the historic information that's there. So it's not just about taking in data of recent, it's also looking at historic data and transforming that into useful information in a data lake.
It'd be really interesting to know if anyone was watching social media when the pound did its spike 2 or 3 days ago, and what was being said and how did we correlate those things.
I think that's only going to get better with predictive analytics, isn't it? Because there's a lot of data out there, we say data-rich information poor, and that's going to get better and better as we start structuring the way that we use our data. So in the future, as these big crashes happen or big events happen, you'll be able to actually go back and look at the data properly and see how it works, whereas currently at the moment, we don't really have the data to analyse, to see past events, because we weren't capturing it properly.
And arguably what we have at the moment is automated trading, which is making it worse rather than certainly the spikes was.
I think the need to react to it is quite important, because let me tell you, nowadays you find the market moving on the basis of Twitter feeds. Somebody puts out a tweet saying that I feel the economy is going to be dicey, you suddenly find the market reacting to it. So if a firm had a proprietary portfolio and wants to protect their interest, it's important to have something which will integrate the Twitter feeds, making sure that those so-called influencers of the market, you find their feeds, read the sentiment and take appropriate action before the market reacts to it. So if there are automatic trading that's happening there, it's important that you automate some bit of your function of risk management equally.
Areas that we might see big data used, I think we've probably talked much about most of those just in the conversation. So particularly thinking about financial services, FinTech, these are the sorts of pieces that we think, and some other people think, we think will be influenced by big data over the coming years. Definitely frauds, definitely insights into what your client is doing. I can remember conversations a number of years ago when I was sitting around bank boardroom tables and talking about how do we know when a customer's going to leave us. It's not when he sends in his closing account form. It's the behaviour that's happened before that might give you some clue, and we're seeing dashboards being built that are either combining what that person is saying on social media, what they're starting to do with their bank balances. All these kind of things are allowing us to predict behaviour or get insight.
It's interesting though, isn't it? The back office processes haven't caught up with the technology. There's a disconnect. And I've seen it recently with the bank where you've got a great front end on Twitter, which ends up looking like lip service if they then come back and say, oh no, hang on, we can't sort that out for you here because that's a different bit of the bank. And what we can do is we can phone you up and then connect you to them on the phone. And then you get a letter in the post about an issue instead of somebody emailing you back, and there's just such a disconnect there.
I would add that moving to the cloud is very difficult for many of the organisations, but if you take like Microsoft Online, Microsoft Social Engagement, you can set up the analysis for social media, you can get the sentiment analysis, and you can get it to push into CRM. But that's only available online, it's only available in the cloud, those innovations. So it's kind of a bit of a stumbling block really for many businesses when there's that keeping the data on premise and security and all the concerns around that.
So I think the whole aspect of what Digital 2.0 has to offer has sort of made things easier in that way. If I were to say the whole aspect of chatbots and making sure you can have a transaction done from Facebook Messenger, How that has happened, how the security is managed, is all something that's sort of given, and it will increasingly give confidence to banks and other businesses to adopt Digital 2.0. Especially when we look at the ease of social media integration nowadays. Putting in a simple Flume sort of interface and taking in the data through a so-called signed secure interface, and making sure you react to that, whether it is, let's say, a chat bot and things like that. As we discuss further, let's delve into those. It will definitely make the adoption of Digital 2.0 much better.
But it is the technology emerging, the security getting better, and then the client confidence and confidence in the market. Goes back a long time, but I can remember deploying, an internet banking solution and trying to deploy it in this island, and having to, in effect, set up a whole telecoms infrastructure with leased lines between us as an organisation and every other financial institution or the client, because nobody would trust the internet. Roll forward 5-6 years, same application, no changes to its security at all, and everyone's using it with the internet. And it's just, it's a sentiment thing. And I think there's the same kind of thing that will repeat.
There seems to be a general acceptance that working your data better is a goal, moving towards this world of big data, but one of the constraints seems to be the capability within firms to unlock that. So this suggests there's a fundamental shift required in the resource-based capability of a bank, of a financial service company. For those who are getting on and adopting it more quickly, what are you seeing in the resource base, the type of people they're recruiting to enable this to happen?
So I think the whole concept of hiring data scientists has been quite prevalent now. For firms that are taking big data seriously, they also need to have engineers who can engineer that data to the utility of the firm. Because otherwise you can just have another failed data warehouse. It's been seen and it's been done many, many times in the past, where people have started pushing data into a relational source and had a few terabytes of data for satisfaction, but not being able to mine that input. I think the fact that the whole mining aspect of getting the meaningful extract from that data has now been automated. And the whole part of looking at either the natural language processing or natural language generation is something that will further assist in terms of being able to mine data better. In terms of firms that want to adopt big data, I think one of the important things is to really look at someone who brings in that knowledge of a data scientist. It's very necessary that those sort of resources are recruited, or firms that have data scientists are put into action, rather than having firms that typically are just into relational data administration.
Can I extend that, sorry, to pick on you for a moment. What observations have you got of the island being a richer pool for that kind of resource? Or do you think we have a deficit and need to find ways of attracting that kind of data science capability?
I think we've got a definite deficit by saying that we've had a few. And I mean, interestingly enough, you talk about data scientists. I think Rod Bryan's education minister was saying to me, he went to a boys' school not too long ago, and he was saying, here, what do you think of the careers of the future? And they came up with all the right ones. He said, including data scientists. And he said, well, okay, what do you guys plan to do? Banker, lawyer, accountant. And that's the gap. I think we are going to have to bring people in the short term because we're not getting it produced here. But you want people here to see that there are some interesting careers in that sort of area.
I think it's important just to have these kind of conversations to start to get us to think what is coming, and then we can start to shape the education system and how we can do that.
I mean, I just thought, do you think government would benefit from having a data scientist?
Government benefit from lots of different things.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in this bit. A colleague went away to Boston recently and went to one of the big kind of public sector leadership events, and they majored a lot of their work on, again, as Scott has described, trying to unlock the power that's embedded in a whole heap of data that's just all over the place. There are plenty of good examples of different states doing that by investing quite heavily in that data engineering, data science activity. So I think certainly, so in the context of the state of Jersey, there is nothing that looks like that kind of capability. So therefore, the aspiration is there, as it is, I imagine, in lots of different private sector firms, but the ability to convert that aspiration into something more meaningful is missing. And that conversion comes, I think, in large part on the capability of resources that we are lacking.
What questions do you really want to ask? You know, I can again sit around tables and people say, well, you know, we need a big data solution. What question do you want to ask? What is it you're really trying to get to? And I think that's the other side of you can find the technology. Well, hopefully we can develop technology capability. We can bring some of that. But also there's the business part of this about, you know, what are you going to do with it? What really do you want to start to? And it's a bit of chicken and egg because you've got to see what's possible and then bring that.
It's important to know where the opportunities lie. You know, I think the fact that Jersey, like Rajesh said, does not have a lot of data necessarily as to constitute a need for a big data, also is a threat because there's so much happening worldwide. There are firms, you know, the whole part of, let's say, for example, Brexit, and saying, let's look at saying how the demand for moving funds is happening and how Jersey can sort of use that as an opportunity. It will be a big opportunity for firms that want to invest in it and say, let's look at what data is out there to try and understand the opportunities. Importantly, I would like to say that, you know, the businesses in Jersey are quite complex. If you look at the funds management business that you would undertake in a lot of firms and things such as that, your clients will want that data. So I'm not saying that the data necessarily is something that Jersey firms would use for themselves. But let's say if you were to provide this as a service to say, we've got big data about these funds, about the investment opportunities, and this is also now available as an advisory service, digitally. That would be a big business to really harness. Because you know, one of the things that Jersey does not lack today is the sheer talent in financial services, legal advice, and things such as that. And if you were to now use the source of getting unstructured data and moving that into a big data, and then saying I'm able to offer this as an advisory service digitally, probably a good business to get in. Also, one of the other things, like Ian had mentioned, big data need not necessarily be big. It's about capturing the various and disparate sources and pooling them in. It is seen, especially I've worked with a few firms here, which have seen that customer sentiment changes and they want to react to that sentiment. The typical reaction is to say, take something online and provide that service. Saying provide a statement of account. What happens to the back end? The moment you put out a digital service, are you capable of now making sure that, you know, you address that requirement? You suddenly have, with the advent of digital, clients accessing their statements online. And how many Jersey businesses today generate statements online? A lot of data that happens in trust and fiduciary industry is typically offline. The assimilation of statements, putting them together, annual reports, it's a difficult task. Now you can imagine usage of digital, especially in technologies like bots, technologies that can have big data, technologies that can have back-end bots really structuring this information like annual reports, etc. for you online will be something that will be very useful. So while the data is not big, I think definitely the data can be more smarter.
I think that's one of the tricks, isn't it? It's not, sometimes people think about big data and they think it's about manipulating massive databases. It's about accessing the benefits of large databases and data sources to improve a one-to-one connection for the customer. And I had a great example the other day, and it involves a Jersey company is involved in this, where, you know, fraud prevention you talked about earlier on. You know, in the old days, credit card companies used to try and use the information on a transaction themselves. They didn't have enough data from the transaction. Now you can actually, if you register your phone number with your bank and you go to use your card, say in New York, they will have your phone number and they can connect into the database through GSMA, and they can go and they can see where your mobile phone is live while you're doing the transaction and decide whether to, so if your mobile phone is in Jersey and your card is in New York, they'll decline the transaction. If they see your mobile phone is in New York as well, they'll let it go through. Because actually that's avoiding them having an unhappy customer, that's avoiding them having to decline a transaction, everything else. But that's tapping into a massive global database effectively.
The other example I was told about similar sort of thing is that in the gaming industry, people are tapping into the device IDs to realise whether that device
Yeah.
is likely to have been one that's sold
Yes.
in the UK or Jersey, or if it's actually one that's more likely to have been sold in Russia or something, and actually the there's a disjoint going on. The gaming companies are using that profiling quite a lot and pulling different databases together. I think to Andrew's point, I think so some finance industries here, some of the bigger banks that have got global headquarters will lean towards that, particularly in the retail space. Others who either for they'll structure themselves differently because of the banking regulations that come in. So some are going to become more unique subsidiaries and they'll do more here. I think some of the smaller firms, as you say, the 100-seat up to 400-seat, are going to benefit from the fact that the price point for some of this technology is dropping rapidly, whether that's through cloud provision and or all sorts of other things that are happening. So I think it's almost that you can price point, you're going to enable people at a smaller scale if they can have the capability and tap into that to use it, whereas perhaps it was prohibitive time.
So last week we had Dominic from Jersey Pottery here, and one of the things that I took away from that was that Jersey Pottery have invested heavily in technology and their systems. They employ no techies at all. It's all outsourced. But they do employ what we're talking about. Hayley, who was here, I can't remember her job title, but it's not what we've just been talking about, but she is a data analyst.
Yeah.
And the information that she's drawing out of their data, whether they didn't call it big data, and I think sometimes big data, the word big is a misnomer there. Yeah, they're, because of the work that they've done investing in their back-end systems and so forth, they can really see business-changing information by having Hayley analysing that data. That was a really...
As you said, that's a restaurant chain.
Yeah, that's a restaurant chain, or whether it's the Feel Unique guys that are doing it in their world. But knowing what question to ask almost is as important as understanding the technology that deliver the answer. Most definitely. And I think we'll see that across all of the different types of industries.
Just to simply put across what's a bot, it's typically a script that can run in the back end to have meaningful information being rendered out as scripts and getting some result. So typically bots are software robots which are supposed to take decisions or supposed to interact. And also the aspects such as chatbots are more in terms of a conversational UI that can enable the use of NLP, not neuro-linguistic programming in this sense, but it's the use of natural language processing to be able to detect what is the content that a client or a user, a consumer is talking about, making meaningful use of that, moving that into knowledge, and then putting the aspect of machine learning into it, and providing output based on what information we have at hand, and then providing this output back again as natural language generation. That's typically what a chatbot is supposed to render, just to make sure taking natural language and then generate natural language. So the interface is seeming more human-like in so to say, in those terms. And I've seen the use of chatbots typically being used in retail banks. And some of the things that we launched recently and probably in the next few months, we will be launching more bots. We're looking at about 100 plus sort of bots to be launched. Typically in the areas of personal finance management. Someone says, I want to invest £10,000 into a portfolio. What's the average return I can expect? And the bot responds from the back end, looking at the information of what products we service, to say these are the various things that you can expect, 5% return for this sort of a model portfolio, 10% for this very high risk portfolio, and things such as that. And interact with the client through natural language to make sure that you can render that service completely.
I must admit, I'm a bit cynical about the bot side of it, because it seems a natural evolution of IVRs and mass market call centres. And if you look at the way the market is going, they're pulling back from that. Because what you find with the way that has gone, it's fine for a very standard query, but anything where there's a degree of complexity, it falls down. and a lot of the standard query stuff is doing online interactions. And I wonder, in a way, you know, we've all had experiences. You get an email back from somebody and you think, yeah, that's a standard email response which doesn't answer the question I actually asked. And I imagine there's going to be a challenge for quite a while with bots where consumers are going to get quite cynical and think, well, hang on, that doesn't help me with anything remotely complicated. Do you think, I mean, from what you've seen of bots, do you think, are they a lot more sophisticated than that? Am I underestimating what they can do?
So I'll just give you a reply to that. Not taking a decision whether you said the right thing or wrong, because I think from the perspective of where we are probably right. Because a lot of bots currently are actually query outputs which are based on the relational data source. It doesn't have something as intelligence to it. One of the things where to make bots successful is the need for really having a link into other unstructured data such as documents. An important aspect on, let's say, policies. Let's start with a firm. Someone says, I want to know how much leave I have left for the year. It's an important query. Now, do you pick up the phone? Do you want to have someone answer that query? Most of the times you will find that the person you want to call up is probably busy in a meeting. But that question is important for you at that point in time, and you want an answer. If it's the same question coming from a client, not about leave, but let's say some other aspect of policy, and it's not rendered, it may really result in a grievance straight away, because somebody didn't pick up the phone. Now, if a bot was able to read through in the backend, through the sort of big data infrastructure, read into unstructured data like documents, etc., and then relate that to the natural language that's been processed, that's one good way of doing it.
In a really interesting case, and it's IBM's use of Watson really is in medical research. So there are thousands and thousands of papers published every day in the US on cancer research. What's happening? How do you connect what is in the body of that research with a question that a practitioner has got somewhere else in the US? And it's a natural language thing, a context sensitive to the question that the practitioner asks. How do you translate that into context, and then how do you translate all of this material that's being researched and added to all the time? And they're getting there. They absolutely are in the US with that. So that, I mean, that's a huge thing. But if you scale that back, the use of natural language, the use of context, understanding what questions people are asking. Yes, I think today the bots are probably the equivalent of the person following the script. So when you phone up a call center, actually mostly what you get is the scripted answer, and the bot just does that. But the difference is you can connect it to all of the other. These things don't happen in isolation; they happen together, or we suspect that's what will happen.
If you looked at a few of the bots that are there, what type of bots are there, and then a few examples will tell you that bots are something that we already use as well. Chatbots, of course, are the ones that are emerging from the aspect of having Facebook Messenger and Google Ola and such as that, and having interactions through not just the messenger with the individual, but also have a link to the business. It is something that's really catching up, and I can tell you, payments processing through chatbots is likely to be bringing a big wave in terms of utility of that. Considering that people find carrying plastic nowadays slightly riskier. Mobile transactions, from perspective of, if you look at how contactless payments have made things easier, that you don't need to enter the PIN and just tap. In the same way, a Facebook Messenger sort of app or link to it will be something that will be transformational from a perspective of increasing the utility of payments digitally. A crawler bot is something that you've already sort of used. Google, for example, is a sort of a crawler bot. And the difference is typically that Google will give you all the number of searches that it's found relevant in that crawl. And you've got to now make sense of it. I think that's the additional layer that will make bots more, the utility of bots more easy. Which is to say that make more sense, understand what I need, which is why in the previous slide we spoke about machine learning. Try and bring it to the context of what the user wants, and then give the output. And that will probably be more useful for the consumer. Transaction bots are typically based transactions, which typically are like, let's say for example, payments done from a chatbot and resulting in the backend. Also, it would be aspects like backend events that you can configure as scripts and have the flexibility of running these bots in the backend. If you look at legacy systems, it is a piece of code that is compiled and you wouldn't know anything that's there in the black box. But if you look at the aspect of getting product processors out of it, having the core in the backend just addressing the rudimentary transaction processing, which is the bulk standard UI-based, desktop-based output, but really having bots that would have scripts that can determine what new transaction and what new type of businesses the firm wants to do. It will be a good way forward. And you'll see a lot of that in the fiduciary business especially.
You walk today and you walk in many of the fund admin businesses and things like that today, much of what they do is checklist driven. Whether that checklist is still a manual checklist, some of them have got it in Excel, some of them maybe got it in SharePoint, but they're still, bill comes in, get checklist out, follow checklist. Well, frighteningly in some ways, this island employs a lot of people doing that kind of work, and it's not going to be there at some point. I've got the crystal ball to tell exactly when, but that sort of activity, which is still in a lot of people's jobs today.
It also de-risks it to an extent.
It de-risks it. It then makes it transparent because these things will be posting to a database somewhere. So can you look at your business and say what's all of the quantum of the admin activity that's going on today? Well, no, you can't at the moment because it's buried in piles of paper. But once it becomes digitized, then you can see how many processes are running at the moment, where's a bottleneck, what's not happening on some kind of dashboard. Today I don't think you can see that. You went to many of the guys running any kind of processing business.
If you look at channel orchestration, for example, to say how you address approaching clients through different channels, it's impossible to have a legacy solution that posts data to really have the entire aspect of extending channels to clients. Instead, if you were to look at the whole aspect of using bots to have scripts that will engage with the backend, it will be far more useful because it's not just the transaction output or an audit trail that you capture, but the unstructured data that you want to add to the transaction is something that you can put as well. The other part is the information bot, very useful for financial services firms and importantly for government. Because you have a query from a citizen to say, I want to query about so and so, you don't want an answer back that it's the other department, please get on there. You have one gov.je and you've got to typically render all their input by making sense from what policies are there in the backend and helping that citizen get that input. Art bots are some things that have been used for typically a bot being programmed for art, but one of the other interesting art bots I was seeing yesterday on YouTube was a flexible printer, which is actually a portable printer that you can have as a robot, put it on top of a page and now ask it to print content and it will print it on top of that. So the aspect of having the A3 page and A1 page and having large printers and big infrastructure being kept in, you can have these small bots you can carry in your bags and then say I'm going to print inputs and just print out stuff. So those are very useful in terms of transformation of content onto, I would say, print source. Game bots, of course, we've seen these, and a lot of kids would obviously know about this, to say, how do you put in scripts to find hacks in games and get those? I don't know if people have written games to find Pikachus now, more easily than going to temples. But this is something that is going to be used in the whole part of how businesses can approach their clients using augmented reality and having gamification of their business and saying, can we have a bot that can sort of make my entire navigation of business flow look interesting to a client? So the whole aspect of bots is, I would think, a very interesting sort of technology that will be very useful for various type of businesses, especially in the Channel Islands. I see the utility of that being in the very different types of businesses firms too. I've been to quite a lot of firms here in the last 12 years of doing business here. And there are different business products that people want to get out, but they are trying to achieve the same result from a standard core back office, which has typically been the issue for people being able to actively go out and market their products. But if you had bots that could generate the scripts for it and enable the product processor to be more outgoing in terms of business friendliness. That will be something very useful.
And I think the final bit is that, you know, these are components. You know, when Jess says I'm going to have 100 different bots, that's 100 components that we can put together in different ways. So in terms of how do you build solutions more quickly, rather than coding from traditional sense.
So I think in terms of bots also, the adoption will vary on the technologies. If you go back to the previous one, you've seen MS Bot as a framework. We launched it in March last year. Few betas have gone on, and it would be soon available on GitHub to start Microsoft-based bots. So you can have, I would like to believe that in the channel analytics, this is something that will probably be more useful to have a Microsoft stack, interact with Office documents and things such as that, SharePoint interaction and things like that, to have outputs done. Facebook bots, probably not so soon, but when you look at consumer access, this will probably get more famous.
Does that only work within Facebook?
Sorry?
Does the Facebook bot only work within Facebook?
Currently, yes, but they have RESTful APIs that can interact with the backend. And you will soon have bots talking to bots, because the RESTful APIs, most of them are standard APIs that come through, and that's the good part, that these are configurable APIs and pretty much open standard.
I think AI is another component of all of this, which perhaps we'll come back to maybe on a different day. The only thing I found was really interesting was reading about Google and how Google is addressing AI, and fundamentally it's by buying different companies. So they bought about 6 to 8 different startup businesses to to bring their portfolio of capability in the AI space. So what is summing all of this up in a way? What is Digital 2.0? It's a plethora of digital experiences, some of which we've touched on. Is there anything else? We've talked about gamification, we've talked about robots. Anything else?
I think the important part, we've seen very simple utilities of, let's say, gesture-based access. We've seen this in Xbox, but the aspect of using a gesture on your mobile to indicate what you want as a service is very useful. And it's a pretty simple thing to do. You don't even need natural language processing for that. So what we've done in the Digital 2.0 stack is to really utilize the capabilities of various aspects, Internet of Things, devices, gestures, smart device integration, to then work with building better bots, have better analytics of data using artificial intelligence and predictive analytics and things such as that. So overall, if you look at the aspect of what digitization 2.0 will entail, it will typically be the ability to look at push notifications for cross-selling, something that the business today isn't able to do. You're typically responding to saying pull, and the ability to say, I think this is, the market's changed, do you want to reorganize your portfolio? Aspects that you did on the phone call, you can do it in a much bigger scale to address a larger set of clients. So the fact that you are constrained with time for, let's say, the half hour to talk to your important clients and address an investment strategy, you can be now saying that you can send out the push notification and then address the client based on appetite for that change.
We bring it back almost for a minute from that plethora of things to one of the areas that you see most stuff happening so far in the payment space. What I like about this representation more than anything else is it brings us back to all of the things on the sort of above the surface, if you like, that we might see happening, whether that's the use of bots, contactless payments and so on, to what you might need to think about inside your organization, or being able to bring together, whether that's outsourcing, by using it in the cloud. But you have to be able to have your information security framework in the right place. Your data stores, your service bus that we just mentioned probably 3/4 of an hour ago, and actually being able to start to have a DevOps model, agile delivery. One of the things that I was mindful of, when you, not that long ago, you build internet solutions and they last for 10 years, and actually they don't change hugely in those 10 years. This stuff is changing every 6 months or less. The cycle time is very, is considerably shorter. How do you cope with a short cycle time of product? And if you haven't got, if you like, the roots right, the infrastructure right, it's very, very difficult to keep up and change. And I think I talk to lots of financial institutions, and they're all suffering with the ability to do that at this point in time. Getting towards the end, I think what we were trying to represent here was Tony's point early on, that we're seeing a lot of this happen, if you like, visually to the customer at the front end. The opportunity, or what will come next, is inside that whole operation space. You know, it's interesting. One of the directors of a business just round the corner here said to me, he said, I go home and I sit on the couch and I do stuff on my iPad and my phone, and it's all fine. I come back into the office and I see the traditional computer with people still operating in Excel and paper forms. Why is that such a huge disjoint? Because internally, operationally, we've not started to embrace these kinds of technologies, but I think that is part of the future, most definitely. And probably finally, I thought, certainly for Scott and Jonathan, who's done a run outside, we just kind of have a quick think about, well, what have we seen happen? What's Rajesh seen in other parts of the world in the government space, which is this is equally as financial services government. The line is very blurred, I think. So do you want to? Is there
So I
anything
think
you wanted to?
the important aspect has been how governments have used big data, especially when it comes to tax avoidance, etc. There are a lot of governments that have built in large pools of large data lakes, captured data that's there in the market, of saying how people have had immigration, taking the immigration data to say they've been frequently traveling, what's the information there, saying traveling to so-and-so location, seemingly on business. And then you have actually no returns back in the taxes here, and how you can sort of dig into the data and make sense out of it to say what's the, how is the behavior beyond the outliers. The other aspect has been typically around customer services. A huge positive there, where citizens typically don't have to look at what department they need to get to. It's just one window to the government, and say that once and it gets done. How that is achievable is only through the aspect of utility of enterprise service plus and big data. Important aspects are about the unstructured data information. To say, for example, if you want to automate the transport system, to say when you should expect a bus. This is something that I saw out in London about 8 years back. Haven't seen much of it working now, though, because I think what's important is to really link it to every other system. Also link it to the aspect of how's the transport situation, how's the traffic, taking data from Google and other sources, navigational sites, and pull that into giving more meaningful data to the client or the citizen. So I would think that government would be one of the biggest consumers of big data and technologies such as digital 2.0.